you know that a great debate has been raging among our fellow Reform Jews in recent weeks and months. You may know because you follow Jewish media closely or are a Jewish professional, or perhaps because I've mentioned it in virtually every class that I've taught over the past couple of weeks. The leadership of the Reform Movement Seminary Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion is now considering closing one of its 3 campuses in the United States, namely the Cincinnati campus, which is, or rather was, the first rabbinical seminary ever established in America. Low enrollment, annual deficits, and major structural issues have led the school to a breaking point. The decision will be made this coming Sunday, one way or the other, and soon I will stop talking about it, which is assuming that the drama subsides quickly, and of course that's somewhat doubtful, but so be it. Over the past few weeks, I've watched hundreds of my colleagues argue bitterly in public and semi-public settings over what the decision should be. Unsurprisingly, these rabbis have opinions. And everyone is convinced that they're right. I should admit, I've also been pretty convinced of my opinion, and I did make the mistake of sharing that opinion on the alumni Facebook page, and the response will certainly take weeks of therapy to undo. But throughout my own consideration of the plans, or rather the school's plans, I've paused a number of times to really wonder if I'm correct that this decision is a necessary one. 2 weeks ago, I listened to a professor in Cincinnati speak provocatively about that campus being the house that the founder of Reform Judaism himself, Isaac Mayer Wise, built 147 years ago. I felt in that moment, even more than I had felt before, how much might be lost if the school chose to close that campus. But I quickly remembered that that very house the founder built is unwell. Not just that campus, but in many ways the whole of the institution. And not just that institution, but much of the communal Jewish landscape across the denominations. And of course, not just Jewish organizations, but so many of the institutions that we cherish in this country. With 2 years of pandemic behind us, even if we have a ways to go before it's over, it's as good a time as any to consider the various houses that are ailing today and figure out what to do about them. For that matter, it's the time of year when Jews across the world start cleaning their houses before Pesach, and it's therefore worth considering what kind of inspection and healing we want to pursue, a subject about which this week's Parsha is punctilious. Since the year is a leap year, the Parsha, typically known as Tazria Mitzorah, is broken up into 2, which means that we have the great fortune of discussing skin infections 2 weeks in a row. But in this week's Parsha, the Mitzorah section, devoted as it is to the mysterious skin disease called Tzara'at, we read that physical structures, houses, can also become infected with it. God explains that when the Israelites enter the land of Canaan, a plague of Tzara'at will erupt in some of their houses. And just like when Tzara'at affects a person, the Torah describes a number of rituals with which the priest can diagnose and cure the problem. But before the issue can be taken care of, the homeowner must first step forward. We read in verse 35, Uva asher lo habayit v'higi lakohen lemor. And he that owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, Kenega nirali babayit. It seems to me that there is something like a plague in the house. My translation here is intentionally tentative, which retains 2 features of the Hebrew. Kenega, meaning something like a plague, and nirali, meaning it seems to me. You almost get the impression from the Hebrew that the person coming to see the priest doesn't want to admit that his house is tainted, or doesn't want to believe that it's so. He says, it seems to me that there is something like a plague in the house, maybe, kind of, I'm just not sure. Rashi, in the 10th century, noticed the same thing about the phrasing of this verse. And he explains it to mean that even if the owner of the house is a learned man, and he knows for sure that it is indeed a plague of tzara'at affecting his house, he shall not decide the matter as a certainty, but merely declare that it seems like a possibility. This is unusual. The Torah does not normally speak like this. It's not normally so indefinite when it comes to commandments. But Rashi's argument, based on an earlier midrash, points to a single letter, a kaf, the k sound in the word kenega, to mean like a plague. And out of that single k sound, the midrash builds a world of meaning, retrojecting an imagined state of uncertainty onto the homeowner, as if it is a value to doubt oneself occasionally. This is precisely the kind of attitude that most of us do not have when approaching a question or debate. It's certainly not the approach that many of my colleagues, nor I, admittedly, have taken during this most recent HUC controversy. It's not how our elected leaders speak to one another, and as Nechama Leibovich points out, this wisdom is particularly relevant to the modern news media and their tendency to present doubtful information as fully established fact. Our ancient sages, much more than our current ones, seem to value uncertainty, at least a little bit, when important issues are at stake. The 16th century commentator on Rashi's commentary, named Eliyahu Mizrahi, reiterates this very lesson. The wording here serves a moral lesson, he explains, that even in the event of certainty about an impurity, one should declare it as doubtful. In other words, even if a person knows well that her home has been infected by this disease, which would render her home impure, she should still approach the matter with curiosity and the possibility that she is wrong. She should still leave room for doubt. This, you might think, is the opposite of what the Torah wants of us. When discussing the nitty-gritty details of a complicated situation, you'd think the Torah would want once and for all resolute answers. But here we find a deeply Jewish imperative in the conclusion of Mizrahi's super commentary. He says, as we read in the Talmud, teach your heart to say, I do not know. It's appropriate that this dictum appears almost at the very beginning of the Talmud, in Brachot 4a. Before any of the greatest debates in our people's history can take place, we need to start with the acknowledgement that we are not God, and we are not prophets. We're not even priests, even the descendants of the Kohanim among us. We are fallible. We don't always know. We must approach every debate with humility. My guess is that the rabbis of yesteryear asserted this early on because they knew it would be a challenge for their intellectual heirs to leave room for doubt in their own assertions. Probably don't need to tell you that as Jews, we frequently take very strong opinions. The Talmud makes that clear, and the surname of people writing letters to the editor of the New York Times also demonstrates that. But for any of us, no matter the debates in which we engage, be they political or religious, personal, institutional, or anything else, even if we are expert in our fields, we must leave room for the possibility that we are wrong. Because by acknowledging that possibility, we grow and get better while remaining in sacred community with the people whom we debate. I sincerely, truly, deeply hope that the leadership of Hebrew Union College makes a decision this weekend that responds to the tzara'at entrenched in its own house. As we read in this parsha, in order to cure tzara'at in a house, the homeowner must first step forward and acknowledge that something is amiss. And I pray that in the weeks and months to come, this healing process, or rather the healing process that hopefully will be among Reform rabbis and Reform institutions, will be rooted in deep humility and the love for one another that comes only when you leave room for the other's perspective. May it be so for HUC, and may it be so for all of us. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Yes, indeed.